She didn't stop trying to fix her life because things were finally working. She stopped because she was exhausted in a way sleep could no longer touch. Not the kind of tired that comes from doing too much in one day, but the kind that settles into your bones after years of effort that never seems to land. She had done everything she was supposed to do. Thought positively. Tried harder. Stayed strong. Kept moving forward even when something inside her was quietly falling apart. From the outside, it looked like she was functioning. She showed up. She handled responsibilities. She smiled when needed. But internally, she lived in a constant state of correction. Always adjusting. Always fixing. Always believing that if she could just change one more thing, her mindset, her habits, her reactions, then life would finally ease. And every time it didn't, she blamed herself for not doing it well enough. She carried an unspoken belief that stopping meant failing. That rest was dangerous. That surrender was weakness. So she kept pushing, even when her body begged her to slow down. Even when her heart felt heavy for no clear reason. Even when hope started to feel like something she had to manufacture instead of something she could trust. What no one saw was how lonely that effort felt. Trying to hold everything together by herself. Trying to be the solution to every problem. Trying to outthink pain, uncertainty, and fear. She wasn't asking life to be perfect, she was just asking it to stop hurting so much. And yet, the harder she tried to fix it, the more distant peace seemed to become. The moment that changed everything didn't come with clarity or strength. It came with collapse. A quiet, internal moment where she realized she couldn't do this anymore. And for the first time, she didn't try to push past that realization. She let it be true. Letting it be true felt terrifying at first. Without the constant effort to fix, adjust, or control, she didn't know who she was supposed to be. Trying had become her identity. Effort had become her safety. So when she stopped, even briefly, it felt like stepping into free fall, no plan, no backup, no version of herself holding everything together. There was no dramatic breakdown. No scene anyone else could witness. Just a stillness that arrived when she finally admitted she was done forcing herself forward. Her body softened before her mind did. Her shoulders dropped. Her breath slowed. And in that quiet, something unexpected surfaced: grief. Grief for how long she had lived in resistance. Grief for the version of herself who believed rest had to be earned. She realized how much energy she had spent trying to outrun uncertainty. Trying to correct her way out of pain. Every strategy had been a way to avoid feeling what she didn't know how to hold. When she stopped fixing, all of it rushed in: sadness, fear, exhaustion, and a deep longing to feel safe without having to prove anything. For the first time, she didn't interrupt those feelings. She didn't label them. She didn't rush to reframe them into something positive. She stayed. She allowed her body to experience what it had been holding back for years. That staying felt raw and unfamiliar, but also honest in a way nothing else had been. There was a moment, subtle, almost easy to miss, when she noticed she was still breathing. Still here. Still intact. The world hadn't collapsed because she stopped managing it. Life hadn't punished her for letting go. That realization didn't fix anything immediately, but it loosened something deep inside her chest. And in that loosened space, something shifted. Not because she tried to change it, but because she finally stopped resisting it. Without the constant need to fix, time began to feel different. Slower. Wider. She noticed how much of her life had been lived in anticipation, waiting for the next problem, the next adjustment, the next moment she would need to step in and correct the course. Now, with her hands off the wheel, there was nothing to anticipate. Only the present moment, unpolished and real. At first, that presence felt uncomfortable. There was no familiar tension to lean on, no urgency to distract her from what she felt. Silence became louder than effort ever had. And in that silence, she came face to face with the truth she had been avoiding: she didn't trust life. She trusted her ability to manage it. And without that management, she felt exposed. That realization didn't shame her. It softened her. She saw how hard she had worked to protect herself. How every attempt to fix had been an act of survival, not failure. She hadn't been controlling because she was rigid, she had been controlling because she was scared. And seeing that allowed compassion to replace judgment for the first time. Her body responded before her thoughts did. There was a warmth in her chest, faint but real. A sense of being held, not by answers, but by something steadier than effort. She didn't name it. She didn't analyze it. She simply noticed that she wasn't alone in the stillness the way she had feared. For the first time, she wasn't trying to move forward. She wasn't trying to get somewhere better. She was simply allowing herself to exist without fixing, correcting, or preparing. And in that permission, something inside her began to reorganize on its own. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment life finally had space to meet her. She had always believed that if she relaxed, everything would fall apart. That her vigilance was the thin line holding her life together. But now, in this unexpected stillness, nothing was collapsing. In fact, something else was happening. Her body was resting in a way it hadn't allowed itself to rest in years. Not sleep, rest. The kind that reaches places effort never could. She noticed how her thoughts softened when she stopped interfering with them. They didn't spiral the way she expected. They came, stayed briefly, and passed. Without resistance, fear lost some of its grip. Without correction, her mind began to settle. It felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, as if calm were something she wasn't used to trusting. There was a moment when she realized she wasn't trying to become someone else anymore. She wasn't reaching for a better version of herself. She wasn't measuring who she was against who she thought she should be. That constant internal comparison had quietly exhausted her, and now, without effort, it had gone silent. In that silence, she felt something deeper than relief. She felt space. Space to breathe. Space to feel without reacting. Space to exist without performance. It wasn't joy. It wasn't peace. It was something more foundational: safety. And safety had been missing for longer than she could remember. She understood then that fixing had never been about improvement. It had been about control. And control had been her way of coping with uncertainty. Letting go of that control didn't make her weak. It made her honest. Honest about how much she had needed reassurance, not solutions. This wasn't the end of her problems. But it was the end of fighting herself. As the resistance faded, something unfamiliar emerged: trust, but not the kind built on certainty. It wasn't trust that everything would work out. It was trust that she could be with life as it was, without collapsing. That realization shifted something deep inside her. For the first time, she didn't need guarantees to feel steady. She noticed how her body responded to this new way of being. The tightness she had carried for so long began to release in small waves. Her breath reached places it hadn't reached before. Her chest felt lighter, not because problems disappeared, but because she wasn't bracing for them anymore. There was a quiet grief that surfaced then. Grief for all the moments she had spent trying to fix herself instead of listening to herself. Grief for the years she believed she had to earn rest, love, or peace. She let that grief move through her without trying to heal it. And in doing so, it softened instead of hardening. She realized how much of her life had been lived from survival rather than presence. Every plan, every adjustment, every correction had been shaped by fear of what might happen if she stopped trying. Now, seeing that pattern clearly, she felt compassion instead of regret. She had done the best she could with what she knew. In this new space, she wasn't reaching for answers anymore. She wasn't asking life to explain itself. She was simply allowing herself to be here, incomplete, uncertain, and still worthy of ease. That permission felt radical in its simplicity. And in that permission, something began to rearrange quietly, not because she asked it to, but because there was finally room for it to happen. What she didn't expect was how life responded to her stillness. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But gently, almost respectfully. Small moments began to unfold without her effort. Conversations felt lighter. Decisions felt clearer. Things that once required force now moved with a quiet cooperation she had never experienced before. She noticed it first in her body. The absence of urgency created space for intuition to surface. She could sense when to act and when to wait without overthinking it. That inner guidance had always been there, but it had been drowned out by noise. Now, without the constant fixing, it could finally be heard. There was a moment when she realized she was no longer afraid of doing nothing. Stillness no longer felt like danger. It felt like alignment. She understood then that much of her exhaustion hadn't come from life itself, but from resisting life as it was. Letting go didn't make her passive, it made her receptive. This receptivity changed how she related to uncertainty. Instead of seeing it as something to eliminate, she began to see it as a doorway. A space where something new could enter without being forced. That perspective softened her relationship with the unknown in a way no strategy ever had. She wasn't manifesting by thinking harder or visualizing better. She was manifesting by creating coherence inside herself. By allowing her nervous system to settle, she stopped blocking what had been trying to reach her all along. For the first time, life didn't feel like something she had to fix. It felt like something she could finally trust. Trust didn't arrive as confidence. It arrived as relief. A quiet release in places she hadn't realized were tense. She noticed how her mornings felt different when she wasn't immediately scanning her life for what needed to be fixed. There was space before thought. A softness that made the day feel less like a test and more like something she could step into gently. She began to see how often she had mistaken control for care. How fixing had felt like love, responsibility, and commitment. Letting go of that pattern didn't mean she stopped caring, it meant she stopped suffocating herself in the name of responsibility. That distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. Moments that once triggered panic now passed without escalation. A delay didn't feel like failure. An unanswered question didn't feel like danger. She stayed present instead of rushing ahead emotionally. And staying present allowed her to respond instead of react. There were times when fears still surfaced. She didn't pretend it was gone. But she no longer treated it as an emergency. She met it with breath instead of action. With awareness instead of correction. That alone softened its impact and shortened its stay. She understood then that surrender wasn't about giving up on life. It was about giving up the illusion that she had to carry everything alone. Something larger than her effort had always been present, waiting, quietly, for her to stop interfering. And in that realization, she felt held in a way she had never allowed herself to feel before. Being held didn't mean life suddenly made sense. It meant she no longer needed it to. Questions remained unanswered, circumstances stayed imperfect, but her relationship with them changed. She stopped tightening around what she couldn't control. And in that loosening, her body began to trust the moment it was in. She noticed how emotion moved differently now. Feelings rose and fell without sticking. Sadness came, but it didn't drown her. Joy appeared, but she didn't cling to it. Everything passed through more freely when she wasn't trying to manage the experience. That flow felt unfamiliar, but deeply human. There were moments when tears came without warning. Not from pain, but from relief. From realizing how long she had lived braced for impact. From sensing that she no longer had to stay armored to survive. Those tears didn't ask to be fixed. They asked to be felt. She realized then that her nervous system was learning a new language. One that didn't speak in urgency or correction, but in presence and allowance. That internal retraining wasn't loud or dramatic. It happened in small, consistent moments of choosing not to interfere. The more she allowed life to meet her where she was, the more she felt supported by it. Not because circumstances changed overnight, but because she stopped standing in opposition to them. Resistance had been the wall. Surrender became the doorway. And quietly, without effort, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope that didn't need to be held up by force. That hope didn't ask her to believe in a better future. It asked her to stay present with the one unfolding. She noticed how different that felt in her body. Hope was no longer a mental reach towards something distant. It became a quiet willingness to remain open, even when she didn't know what was coming next. She began to sense subtle shifts in her daily life. Not dramatic changes, but gentle alignments. She would think of someone and receive a message moments later. She would release a worry and find a solution without searching for it. These moments didn't feel miraculous, they felt natural, as if life had been waiting for her to stop forcing outcomes. There was a growing awareness that effort had never been the source of her transformation. Presence was. By no longer trying to fix herself, she had stopped sending the message that something was wrong. And in that absence of self-rejection, something deeply healing took place. She realized how much of her suffering had come from resisting the present moment. From believing that now was never enough, never safe, never complete. Letting go of that belief didn't make her passive. It made her receptive to what was already here. Her body continued to soften into this new way of being. Breath became slower. Movements became intentional. Even her thoughts carried less urgency. It felt as though her entire system was recalibrating, not toward perfection, but toward coherence. She didn't yet know what would change in her life externally. But she knew something fundamental had shifted internally. And for the first time, that felt like enough. What surprised her most was how little she needed to do to sustain this shift. There was no constant vigilance required, no discipline to maintain the state. The more she stayed present, the more natural it felt. Effort had been replaced by attention. And attention required far less energy than control ever had. She began to notice how life responded differently when she wasn't trying to manage every detail. Doors didn't necessarily open faster, but they opened more cleanly. Conversations unfolded with less friction. Choices revealed themselves without the inner struggle she once mistook for responsibility. There was a quiet intelligence at work, not in her thoughts, but in her experience. A sense that things were aligning without her intervention. She didn't label it. She didn't try to understand it. She simply noticed that when she stopped interfering, life seemed to know what to do. This realization softened her relationship with timing. She no longer felt behind. She no longer felt rushed to arrive somewhere else. Being here stopped feeling like a mistake. The present moment felt sufficient, not perfect, but trustworthy. She understood then that fixing had been her way of demanding certainty from an uncertain world. Letting go didn't remove uncertainty, it removed the demand. And without that demand, life felt less threatening and more cooperative. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for her life to begin. She was already living inside it. Living inside her life felt unfamiliar at first. She had spent so long preparing, correcting, and bracing for what was next that actually being present felt almost disorienting. There was no rush, no inner checklist demanding improvement. Just moments unfolding one after another, asking nothing from her except honesty. She began to notice how her perception shifted when she wasn't scanning reality for problems. Ordinary moments carried a quiet beauty she had overlooked before. Light through a window. The sound of her own breath. The simple relief of not being at war with herself. These weren't extraordinary experiences, but they felt profound because she was finally available for them. There was a tenderness that emerged in how she treated herself. She no longer spoke to herself in commands or corrections. She listened. When something felt heavy, she didn't rush to fix it. She stayed with it. And staying softened what force never could. She realized how often she had confused intensity with meaning. How she believed that struggle made her life important. Now, without that struggle, her life felt quieter, but also more real. Meaning wasn't something she had to earn through suffering. It was something that revealed itself through presence. This new way of being didn't remove challenges. But it changed her posture toward them. Instead of tightening, she softened. Instead of fighting, she allowed. And in that allowance, solutions appeared without pressure. She was no longer trying to become someone else. She was finally allowing herself to be here, exactly as she was. In this new stillness, she began to notice something unexpected, a sense of guidance that didn't come from thought. It wasn't a voice or a sign. It was a quiet knowing that surfaced when she stopped asking questions. When she wasn't trying to decide, analyze, or predict, clarity arrived on its own. She realized how often she had mistaken effort for alignment. How she believed that if she wasn't actively fixing something, she was falling behind. Now, she could feel the difference. Alignment felt spacious. It didn't demand urgency. It didn't come with tension in her chest. It simply felt right, calm, steady, undeniable. Moments of insight appeared without force. She would wake up with a sense of direction she hadn't gone to sleep with. She would feel drawn to make a choice without needing to justify it. These weren't dramatic revelations. They were subtle shifts that carried a surprising amount of certainty. She noticed that when she trusted these moments, things unfolded more smoothly. Not perfectly, but coherently. One step led to the next without resistance. Life stopped feeling fragmented. It felt connected, as if something unseen was quietly supporting the flow. This support didn't make her feel special or chosen. It made her feel included. Included in a rhythm she had always been part of, but never fully trusted. Letting go of fixing allowed her to feel that connection without trying to control it. For the first time, she wasn't asking life to show her the way. She was allowing herself to follow it. Following it didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet. Almost ordinary. And yet, that quiet carried a depth she had never known before. She wasn't being pulled forward by urgency or fear. She was being guided by something steadier, a sense of inner agreement that didn't need explanation. She began to notice how much lighter her decisions felt. Not because they were easier, but because they weren't charged with self-judgment. If something didn't work, it wasn't proof that she had failed. It was simply information. That shift removed a weight she had carried for most of her life. There was a softness in how she related to uncertainty now. She no longer demanded immediate answers. She allowed things to unfold in their own timing. And in that allowance, patience appeared, not as discipline, but as trust. She felt moments of deep emotion rise unexpectedly. Sometimes gratitude. Sometimes tears. Not because something painful had happened, but because she could feel how much she had been holding herself together for so long. Letting go of that grip made space for emotion to move freely again. She realized that what she had been seeking all along wasn't change. It was safety. Safety to feel. Safety to rest. Safety to exist without constantly correcting herself. And that safety had never been outside her reach, it had only been hidden beneath effort. Now, without trying to fix her life, she was finally allowing it to reach her. It was during this quieter phase that she felt drawn to write, not to plan her life, not to manifest outcomes, but to stay connected to what she was experiencing. Writing didn't come from effort. It came from the need to anchor what was happening inside her before it slipped away. Words became a way to remain present without trying to control the process. She didn't sit down with expectations. She didn't ask the page to fix anything. She simply allowed her thoughts to land somewhere outside her body. As the pen moved, she noticed how much clarity arrived without force. Writing slowed her down just enough to keep her from returning to old habits of correction and overthinking. There was something grounding about seeing her inner state reflected on paper. It made the shift feel real. Tangible. No longer just an emotional moment that might pass, but an experience she could return to. Writing became a place where she could meet herself honestly, without judgment or urgency. She noticed that when she wrote, her body stayed regulated. Fear didn't escalate. Doubt didn't spiral. The page held space for everything without asking her to resolve it. That containment allowed her nervous system to stay open instead of retreating back into control. Over time, writing became less about processing and more about presence. A way to check in rather than figure out. To listen rather than fix. It wasn't something she used to change her life, it was something she used to stay aligned with it. And without realizing it yet, this simple act of writing was becoming the bridge between surrender and stability. What surprised her most was how consistent writing changed the way she stayed open. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't create emotional highs. It simply kept her connected to herself day after day. When she didn't write, she noticed how quickly old patterns tried to return, the urge to fix, to control, to push. Writing gently interrupted that reflex. The journal became a place where she could return to surrender without having to recreate the collapse that led her there. She didn't need to fall apart again to remember what letting go felt like. The page reminded her. It anchored the state she had discovered so unexpectedly. She began to see writing as a form of devotion to presence. Not a task, not a habit to maintain, but a quiet commitment to honesty. Each time she wrote, she reaffirmed that she didn't need to force life into shape. She only needed to stay available to it. There were days when nothing profound came out. Just simple observations. Simple acknowledgements. And those days mattered just as much. They taught her that alignment wasn't about intensity, it was about continuity. Showing up gently, even when nothing dramatic was happening. Through this practice, she learned how to recognize when she was slipping back into effort. The journal didn't judge her for it. It simply reflected it. That reflection allowed her to soften again, without shame, without self-correction. What she was building wasn't a new identity. It was a stable relationship with surrender, one she could return to whenever life tried to pull her back into control. As writing became part of her days, she noticed something subtle but powerful: surrender no longer felt fragile. It had structure. Shape. Continuity. What once depended on emotional openness now had a rhythm that supported it. Writing wasn't something she did only when she felt centered. It became the thing that helped her return when she wasn't. She realized that staying open required intention. Not force, not discipline, but a container that could hold her awareness consistently. The journal became that container. A space where she could reconnect with presence without having to relive exhaustion or collapse. It allowed surrender to mature into something steady. Over time, her entries began to change. They weren't about what was wrong anymore. They reflected trust. Gratitude. Willingness. Not in a performative way, but in a grounded one. Writing showed her that when she stopped trying to direct life, life responded with coherence. She began to understand that this wasn't about giving up action. It was about acting from alignment rather than tension. The journal helped her notice the difference. When action came from pressure, it felt heavy. When it came from presence, it felt clean. Writing made that distinction clear. This clarity didn't make her passive. It made her precise. She moved when it felt right. She paused when it didn't. And for the first time, she trusted that this rhythm was enough. That she didn't need to rush life to meet her. What started as surrender had become partnership. And the journal was quietly holding that partnership in place. It was only later that she realized what had actually happened. She hadn't given up on her life, she had stopped fighting it. And that distinction mattered. What she was living wasn't passivity. It was alignment sustained over time. The journal had quietly transformed surrender into something she could return to, day after day. She began to see this period as a cycle rather than a moment. A process that unfolded gradually, not all at once. Each day she wrote, she was choosing to remain open instead of reactive. That repetition mattered. It allowed her nervous system to trust the state she had entered, instead of waiting for it to disappear. This was when she committed to a longer container. A dedicated period of daily writing designed not to create outcomes, but to stabilize presence. 33 days of meeting herself honestly. 33 days of choosing alignment over correction. Not because 33 was magical, but because consistency was. The 33 Days Manifestation Journal didn't promise change through effort. It supported change through continuity. It gave her a structure where surrender could live without fading. Where awareness could deepen without pressure. Where life could unfold without interference. Day by day, something solid formed beneath her feet. Not certainty about the future, but trust in the process. She no longer needed to fix her life to feel safe inside it. She only needed to stay present with what was unfolding. She didn't force the shift. She stayed with it. And that made all the difference. What changed next wasn't loud. It didn't arrive as a breakthrough moment or a visible miracle. It arrived as stability. The kind that doesn't demand attention because it's quietly holding everything together. Her days began to feel less reactive. Less fragile. Even when challenges appeared, they no longer pulled her back into old patterns of urgency. She noticed how her body responded to this new rhythm. Mornings no longer carried the same weight. Decisions no longer felt like tests. There was space between stimulus and response, space she had never allowed herself before. And in that space, she could feel herself choosing differently without effort. Life didn't become perfect. But it became workable. Supportive in subtle ways. When something didn't go as planned, she didn't collapse into self-correction. She stayed present. She wrote. She listened. And somehow, solutions emerged without force, as if life were meeting her halfway. She realized then that surrender hadn't taken anything from her. It had returned something she thought she had lost, trust. Not trust that everything would go right, but trust that she could remain whole no matter what happened. That trust was what made her feel safe enough to live fully again. The journal continued to anchor her in this state. Not as a ritual, but as a relationship. A place she could return to when the world felt loud. A reminder that alignment wasn't something to achieve, it was something to maintain gently. She hadn't fixed her life. She had stopped standing in the way of it. Looking back, she could finally see how much of her life had been shaped by resistance. Not dramatic resistance, but the quiet kind, the constant belief that something was wrong, that discomfort meant failure, that pain was a sign she needed to act immediately. For years, she had lived as if every feeling required correction, as if peace were something that could only exist after everything was resolved. Letting go of that belief didn't remove difficulty from her life. Challenges still appeared. Uncertainty still existed. But the way those experiences moved through her changed completely. They no longer lodged themselves in her chest or demanded her identity. Life stopped feeling like an enemy she had to outthink or outrun. It became something she could meet, imperfect, unpredictable, and still safe. There was a new tenderness in how she related to herself. A patience that had never been available when she was constantly fixing. When fear surfaced, she didn't argue with it or push it away. She listened. When uncertainty appeared, she didn't rush to escape it. She stayed present long enough to realize that these feelings were not threats, they were signals asking for attention, not solutions. She understood then that the deepest shift had nothing to do with changing her circumstances. Everything had shifted the moment she stopped making her life a problem to solve. The moment she stopped treating herself as unfinished, broken, or behind. That internal war had been exhausting her far more than any external challenge ever had. The journal didn't rescue her from pain or deliver answers on demand. Surrender did. The journal simply helped her remember, day after day, that she didn't need to fix her life to be worthy of peace. That she didn't need to arrive somewhere else to feel safe where she was. And that realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly, gently, and permanently into who she was becoming. She didn't wake up one day feeling healed, enlightened, or free from all fear. What changed wasn't the absence of difficulty, but the absence of war inside her. Life still asked things of her. Uncertainty still existed. But she was no longer fighting every moment as if it were a threat. She had learned that peace doesn't come from fixing the future, it comes from stopping the internal resistance to the present. There was a quiet strength in how she moved through her days now. Not the strength of effort or endurance, but the strength of someone who trusts herself enough to stay open. She no longer measured her worth by how well she managed life. She allowed herself to be human without turning that humanity into a problem that needed solving. What she discovered was simple, but it changed everything. The moment she stopped trying to fix her life, life finally had space to reach her. Not because she deserved it more, or tried harder, but because she was no longer blocking it with fear, urgency, and control. Surrender became the doorway she had been searching for all along. She still wrote. Not to manifest outcomes, but to remain connected to this truth. Each page became a reminder that she could return to herself without force. That alignment didn't need to be dramatic to be real. And that presence, practiced gently over time, was enough to change how life responded to her. She didn't fix her life. She stopped interfering with it. And in that space, quiet, honest, and unguarded, everything shifted.